Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, Chapter 2, Halacha 3. In Chapter 2, Halacha 2, we were covering the Chaver and what it takes to be considered trustworthy. And we know that, they have to go commit to separate out the tithes properly. That way they can be trusted with regards to Demai. But now in Halacha 3, it's going to get into something that was hinted at in Chapter 2. That's going to be with regards to being trusted with regards to Tohoros as well. Not only to the issues of Tohoros, which is going to be what is Demai and Tahor, both Doraita. We know that there are many Doraita things that can make you Demai. For instance, holding a sheretz, or being a zav, or touching a nida. These are things that can make you Demai. Also, being a nida and touching your doughs, and if you're making challah or dough, also can make the dough Demai. Same if you're doing laundry, you can make the clothes Demai. So, also coming in contact with a corpse. These are all cases of something that's going to be Doraita. Now, we also have Darabanan issues as well. So, for instance, what happens if somebody is now going to be a Rishon, and then they're going to touch something like for food, and their hands are not going to be washed, then they can make the chulin you can have like a derabanan issue where you've contaminated chulin, which is going to be an untithed food. You can contaminate it on a derabanan level, not a doraita level in that particular case. Although you can have cases where you can contaminate food on a doraita level. For instance, if you had the chulin grain, let's say it got wet, and it's with one of the 7 liquids, and then what happened is there's a dead sheretz there. Well, that's going to contaminate part of the chulin. And another case would be if you're trying to bake bread, and there's a sheretz in the oven. That's also going to, because one is going to be an avatuma, and it can make it so that you have the bread. The bread will be a rishon, and that will be on a doraita level, not a derabanan level. But you have other cases on a derabanan level, particularly with netalat yadayim issues, not washing your hands, and also in some cases on some things in utensils in some cases. So we know that you have 2 issues here to be a chaver. There's going to be one is you're going to have to come and you're going to have to separate the ties correctly, but you're also going to have to commit to keeping the laws of Tohoros properly, not only the Doraita ones, but the Darabanan ones as well. And again, as we learned in Chapter 2, Halacha 2, if you're excluding any one of these, then you don't count. So even if you're going to say, okay, well, I'm going to be very careful on my tithes, but I'm, these Darabanan restrictions on Tohoros are too hard to keep. There's too many of them, too complicated to learn. I'm just not going to worry about those ones. Well, guess what? You're not trusted with regards to the tithes either. So anything that disqualifies on one disqualifies on all for a chaver, somebody who wants to be trusted with regards to this stuff. Now, these issues are also kind of going to be coming up in the modern world as well. For instance, what happens if you're eating at the house of Am Haaretz? Can you really be sure that can you really be sure about the kashrus? Another issue. Let's say you're having Amaratzim guests come to your table. Are you sure they're going to say a bracha on the food? And now you're basically putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person. You're giving him food, and Amaratzim don't really say brachot on food. So now you've kind of helped him to go and make an avera. So these issues are somewhat tangentially related even today. So the Mishnah starts off and it says that someone who wishes to accept upon himself to be a haver has to commit to the following practices. And again, somebody who wants to be a haver, this is literally going to be, says the Rambam commentary in the Mishnah, literally a friend. And the Rambam is explaining that the term haver is actually a designation given to Torah scholars because they share a true friendship with one another, and also they are friends with God, basically. Hashem calls the righteous their friend, his friend. And the term is applied to those who are going to follow the practices described in this Mishnah as well as the previous Mishnah. And these practitioners are basically just Torah scholars or someone who really, maybe they're not a Torah scholar, but they really have studied a lot and have worked on it. Now, a lot of these issues on Tohoros take a lot of work in order to do it. And that's actually going to be coming up because what happens if the Amaret says, okay, well, this grain, it became wet, but it's tahor, it's pure, it's clean, it hasn't been contaminated. You can't trust them because, these laws are so intricate that they themselves don't know what contaminates and what doesn't contaminate. And they're just not expert enough in order to do it. So generally, these are going to be Torah scholars. So he has to commit to the following practices. Says the Mishnah, says that he must accept upon himself not to sell food to an Amaretz, whether it was once wet or whether it was always dry. So what this is trying to say, says Bnei Moshe, is that the Chaverim have to be careful not to sell or give food that's going to be tahor. Even, by the way, chulin to an Amaretz. Chulin is going to be before they separate tithes. And this is because it's had the tithes separated from it. So it's going to be where it's been rectified. It's not tevel, and it's not the part that's kodesh. It's the part that's left over. So why is it that you can't give even chulin or any food that's tahor to an Amaretz? And the idea is because the Amaretz is always going to be considered temei because they don't know how to keep the laws of Tohoros. That means they're always in a contaminated state, and they're going to make the food temei. And the Mishnah is holding that you're not allowed to cause tuma, even, by the way, to chulin, if it is from, chulin in Eretz Yisrael. So that, by the way, you can see in Bavli Avodah Zarah 55b. And so there's always an inyan, there's always an idea, which, by the way, is Doraita, comes from the Torah itself. It says you shall safeguard the foods, and you're not supposed to let sacrificial foods become contaminated. This, again, is spiritual contamination. And what happens if you eat it, right? Well, you're not supposed to eat it, but if you eat it, let's say you want to go do a sacrifice today. Well, you can't. You can't do it. And if you're following the issues of Ezra, Ezra had a proclamation that we learned about in Berachot about going to the mikveh every day and not becoming temei. And if you become temei, you can't learn, you can't pray. So there's issues if you become temei. That, by the way, lapsed and the people were not able to keep it. But who knows, it may come back again. So the idea is that you can't give this tahor food to an Amaretz, whether it was wet or dry. And you're not allowed, says the Mishnah, to buy from him food that was once wet. So this is really getting into, we know that food that if it gets wet, it can receive tuma. And so, again, it's one of the 7 liquids. Let's say it got wet from water. So it can become temei. And a haver cannot purchase food from the Amaretz because it could have been turned into become temei by the Amaretz. and a chaver is not going to go eat tamei food. And even if the Am Haaretz is going to go say, well, it's not tamei, he's not trusted. And that's always, by the way, going to be the issue. The Am Haaretz is usually not going to be trusted. The only difference over here is going to be if the Am Haaretz says that this never became wet, you're allowed to trust him on that. But if the Am Haaretz says it did become wet, but it is tahor, you're never allowed to trust him because he himself is an Am Haaretz. He doesn't know how to care for it to keep it at a level of being tahor, of being pure. And we know that the haver is only going to try to eat food that is tahor. And the Chazan Ish says about this in Demai 5:8, the prohibition for haver to purchase from an Am Haaretz produce that was once wet applies only if the haver intends to treat it as being tahor. And even Chaverim eat tamei food when they themselves are tamei. So a chaver may purchase produce from an Am Haaretz to eat it when he is tamei, says the Chazan Ish. So that, by the way, is true. Like if the haver is tamei, for whatever reason, he's allowed to eat tamei food. Not a big deal. But if he's trying to stay pure so that he can do the avoda at a higher level, he can do the maybe a sacrifice later that day. He wants to stay in a state of purity. Why does that matter? Well, when we look in Ibn Gibriol's book on the Fountain of Life, there are really three mechanisms that he's looking at in Olam Hazeh. One is going to be the material, one is going to be the form of something, and the other is going to be the soul resting in the combination of the form, the material, and the soul. And he calls that yesod. That's also a term by the Kabbalists. And basically, as things get more and more tamei, or more and more tahor, things will get closer to Hashem or further from Hashem. So if you get into this status of being tamei, the material that you have ends up becoming more coarse and less receptive to divine light and divine blessing and all of the things that come with being close to Hashem. So he's trying to protect his body to be in a state of Tohoros and to be pure, so that he can experience metaphysically this relationship with Hashem at that higher level where everything about him, his form, his soul, and the material of his goof is at a more refined level, so it can receive more of this divine light and divine providence, as explained by Ibn Gibriol. And the mission is going to continue. It's going to say that he cannot be hosted by an Am Haaretz. Now, we're going to see why there's a restriction on this. And it looks like this Mishnah is repeating what we saw in chapter 2, but this is actually going to be repeated for a different reason. So over there in chapter 2 was, you would worry that, perhaps it's because, he's not going to be tithing the produce correctly at the guy's house, or he's not going to be eating it correctly, or perhaps, he maybe went off the derech for the dinner, and, maybe he didn't tithe the produce at all, or maybe he's tithing it silently, or something like that. But we're doing over there in chapter 2, Halacha 2 of Demai, because of issues of separation. Over here, it's going to be issues of being tahor, tamei and tahor. So that's why this is going to be repeated again here. So you're not supposed to be hosted by an Am Haaretz, and not to host an Am Haaretz in the Am Haaretz's clothing. Why? Because the clothing does get laundered. It becomes wet by being laundered, and usually they put it into water, or even a mixture of water and soaps and detergents. They did have detergents back then. They were generally made with all sorts of products from seashells that they would roast to make lime, and they would take the lime and they would use it to do the clothing. So over here, the problem with the clothing of the Amaretz is he doesn't know how to keep it from becoming contaminated. So if he was to be given something to wear, he doesn't know how to keep it tahor. So if he puts on the clothing of the Amaretz that's going to be temei, he's going to make himself temei. And even though he becomes tahor after the day, he's at a lower spiritual level. And if he's trying to keep what Ezra set up, where he's going to not learn while he's temei, that is betul Torah. So the Mishnah continues, and Rabbi Yudah says that he must also commit to not raise small domestic animals, and not to overindulge in vows or frivolity. Not overindulging in vows or frivolity is good advice even for Jews today. There's a Gemara that I believe it's in Gittin that making vows leads to poverty. Why? Because even if there's no temple and things like that, Hashem still regards vows as being very, very serious. And if you don't keep a vow, you will get divine punishment for it. And it can lead to all sorts of misfortunes. Very serious not to do vows, and to learn how to speak so that you're not doing vows or oaths and these false representations in particular. And frivolity, things that have lightheadedness or whatever. One of the big things in today's generation is to stay away from the games of the Goyim, for instance, soccer or basketball, because it is frivolous. You sit at the Yankees game for 4 hours, and what did you accomplish? It's kind of nonsense. So what about the domestic animals? And this, by the way, is getting back to when the Jews entered the land. This is one of the prohibitions that Yeshua set up. And the small domestic animals like a goat or a sheep, they tend to go off from property. They're very independent-minded, and they'll go and eat on other people's fields. And that, by the way, constitutes theft. It's gezel. Why? Because that other guy needs it for his stuff. He might have geese, he might have ducks, he might have chickens, he might have cows, and they go and they eat the grass over there. And if your animal is going and eating up all the grass, particularly, by the way, the goat will eat it right and pull up the roots so that it's not even going to grow back. It's just going to be left like... there's a difference, by the way, between the way a goat eats grass and the way a sheep eats grass. The sheep will sever the grass above the root, so eventually it'll grow back. The goat rips it out so that it just ends up barren. So it does consider... it's considered as theft in the halacha. So Rabbi Yudah is adding that this person also, really has to be at a higher level in terms of his derech eretz. He has to not raise these animals because they steal, and he's contributing to theft, and not overindulge in vows or frivolity. And the Mishnah continues and says not to render himself tamei through the contact with the dead. So generally speaking, there's no prohibition for a haver to become tamei because he can just go back to the mikvah. But the problem with tuma from the dead is that you need the ashes from the paraduma. And where do you get them? So this prohibition ends up, being kind of like he's a Kohen, because a Kohen has a Doraita issue not to contaminate himself. The Haver is trying to be careful not to contaminate himself because, first of all, he's contaminated for a week, 7 days, and then the issue is where does he purify himself? He needs the ashes of the paraduma. Where do you get that? So that's something that he's going to be very careful about. And the Mishnah continues and says he must serve Torah scholars who are found in the study hall, and the sages said to him, these things are not included. So the sages do not require these additional commitments from a haver, as they're not related to issues of tuma or tahara, says the Rosh. But the Chazan Ish says about this that Rabbi Yehuda maintains that since these negative practices are associated with the Am Haaretz, a Haver must try to distance himself from those sorts of behaviors. And so it's really trying to stay away from the behavior of the Am Haaretz. Now, the sages do not require that the Haver spend time studying with the scholars in the study hall, but they do require that he be knowledgeable in the laws of Tuma and Tahara so he can keep them properly. And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in his Beurim book says the sages do not require intensive study, the same intensive study that Rabbi Yehuda requires. So the Gemara starts off, and we're getting these laws of Tuma, and it says that the prospective Haver must commit not to buy from the Am Haaretz food that was once wet. And the Gemara is implying and says, this implies that if the Am Haaretz says that the food was always dry, it is permitted for the Haver to buy it. He does not need basically to suspect that it was once wet since it's dried. And because the Am Haaretz can be trusted on susceptibility for the produce of Tuma. In other words, if it never became wet, he can be trusted on that. But once it became wet, he can't be trusted because he doesn't know the laws, these intricate laws on how to protect the status of it from becoming Demai. But, if the Am Haaretz says, okay, it never became wet, he can be trusted on it. And that's what this is implying, says this Gemara. So the Gemara is going to support a ruling for it. And it says, and likewise, it was taught in a Brisa that an Am Haaretz is trusted to say that these fruits have not become susceptible to Tuma. In other words, they never became wet. However, he may not be trusted to say that they indeed became susceptible to Tuma, but they did not contract Tuma. So he can't be trusted on that because he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know the laws on how to protect it. And I want to point out something by the Rambam. The Rambam says the reason the Am Haaretz is not trusted when they state that produce has not become Demai is that they are not expert in the complex laws of Tuma and Tahara, and therefore they're not competent to make a determination, says the Rambam. So the Mishnah stated that Rabbi Yehuda says that he must also commit to these several other practices, and now the Gemara is going to delve into the list of these practices, and the Gemara says that this word also implies that practices listed in the Mishnah by the Tanakama. So Rabbi Yehuda evidently agrees that a Haver must commit not to be hosted by an Am Haaretz, and let's unpack that. Basically, the Gemara is asking, says the Gemara, does this agreement by Rabbi Yehuda that a Haver may not be hosted by the Am Haaretz not contradict Rabbi Yehuda's ruling in the preceding Mishnah, as explained by Rabbi Yonah? So in the previous Mishnah, in the previous sugya that we had in chapter 2, Halacha 2, the case came up where you have the Am Haaretz, he's not supposed to eat at the house. The Haver is not supposed to eat at the house of the Am Haaretz, and if he does, he's got a problem. So Rabbi Yehuda is going to say that he can still be trusted, and the sages say that he's not to be trusted. We go by the Tanakama when there's a dispute where there's one Tana against the sages. We go by the majority. So the question over here and over there is, over there, it's going to be regarding tithes. Over here, it's going to be an issue regarding keeping things Tamei and Tahor. So over there in chapter 2 Halacha 2 says this Mishnah, says this Gemara, it says, for Rabbi Yonah said over there, people who are friendly with the Am Haaretz and therefore eat in their homes are, according to Rabbi Yehuda, not suspected of eating actual Demai. and they are therefore not suspected of feeding these foods to other people. Now, that again is not the halacha. Halacha says that the Tanna Kama excludes them and says that they ate over there. They can't be trusted when they try to go sell their own produce now to other people. So if they say, "Oh, I separated tithes," you can't trust them anymore. Halacha is going to be by the Tanna Kama. But what this brings up is what happens when he eats at the home of the Am Haaretz, and he does not actually eat any Demai. So under Rabbi Yuda's position, that's fine that he might be trustworthy with regards to maasros, and he might be trustworthy with regards to the tithes. But I think what this is pointing out is how could that be? Because you can't presume that he could be trustworthy with regards to Tohoros. And it should be that, this person is going to lose his trustworthiness, regarding Tohoros when he eats at the house of the Am Haaretz. Why? Because the utensils, the Am Haaretz, are always getting wet, and he's always cooking in them, and he can't keep the utensils tahor. And he just doesn't have the intellectual knowledge on how to, like you have a spoon, right? And the spoon has an indentation in it. How do you keep it from becoming temeh? Or now you're going to go put it into a hot pot, and how do you know you didn't just take hulin that and contaminate it? So or you're cooking it in a pot, and how can you trust that this Am Haaretz had the pot, and the pot is going to be tahor? You fill it up with water, so now it has water, and now you've put it onto a heat. How do you know that this thing is in temeh, and that the food's not temeh? So Rabbi Yuda's point is basically like, okay, fine. Maybe he didn't eat Demai. Maybe, there's not a problem with separation. And I think that's part of the problem that the Tanna Kama have, is to say, it's very nice that you can say that, he was very careful about, not eating something that was not separated properly, but who's to say he didn't eat something that was temeh? And why did he let himself go over there to be hosted and put himself into that position where he could eat something that's tameh? So the Gemara is going to answer this, and it's going to say the reason the Haver must not be hosted by the Am Haaretz is so that he not go and inadvertently make his body tameh there and then come home and make his tahor food in his home tameh. And so it's irrelevant that the Haver will not eat tameh food in the home of the Am Haaretz. What does this mean? Well, maybe he touched a dish rag there, or maybe he sat on a cushion, or maybe he, he went into the roof, under the roof, and the Am Haaretz is not careful about, or doesn't know about certain things, and there might have been something in there that contaminated with contaminations for the roof. So, like you have a lot of issues with sheretz. What's a sheretz? It could be a dead snail. It could be a dead rat. It could be a dead frog or a dead lizard. And, these things will contaminate, and you have all sorts of issues with a roof. Why did the Haver go in there and potentially make himself tameh? And so you'd say, well, even if he separated ties properly, that he basically put himself into a position where he made himself tameh, and now he's going to go home, and he's going to take his tahor food and do things with it, and he made his tahor food tameh. That's part of the issue. So the Gemara turns to Rabbi Yossi's explanation of Rabbi Yuda's opinion in the last Mishnah, because again, it sort of repeats over here, over there, and over here. It's both saying that you can't be hosted by the Am Haaretz, and over there again, it's implying based on tithes. Over here, it's based on things being tameh and tahor, and based on Rabbi Yossi's opinion, basically the Gemara says, furthermore, Rabbi Yuda's opinion implied or ruling in this Mishnah does not contradict his ruling in the previous Mishnah, even as explained by Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yuda's over here and over there. What's the difference? And the Gemara says, when Rabbi Yossi said people who are friendly with the Am Haaretz and therefore eat in their homes are indeed suspected of eating Demai, according to Rabbi Yehuda, they are nevertheless not suspected of feeding food that is not tithed to others. Why? Because food that's not tithed can give you death from heaven. So even if this guy went to the Am Haaretz's house, and let's say he ate food that wasn't properly tithed, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that nonetheless, this guy who once was a haver and then broke it by eating at the Am Haaretz's house knows enough not to he knows enough to separate out tithes and not to go feed it to people. Why? Because he might be dealing with definite tevel at some point. So the Gemara continues and says, over there, Rabbi Yossi spoke about maestros. That's, again, referring to chapter 2, halacha 2. And over here, in chapter 2, halacha 3, the Mishnah is dealing with Tohoros. And with regards to maestros, people are generally going to be careful about it. And so, somebody might be very careful not to eat the Demai. But what this is trying to point out, and why this has to be its own Mishnah in chapter 2, is that, the rules of Tohoros, people are generally less careful about it. It's harder to do. It takes more education. You have to spend more time learning about it and how to do it. And so that's going to be a different set of issues. So somebody might know about tithes and be careful about it, but he might not really know enough about Tohoros or be careful about it. So it needs a separate set of conditions. So the Gemara now is going to give support for this distinction between maestros and Tohoros. And there's a brisa that says this Gemara, one who is trustworthy regarding Tohoros, in other words, he's known to be careful with Tohoros. It's going to be, says this Gemara, that he's trusted regarding maestros. So maestros are easier to keep than the laws of Tohoros. All you need to do to see there's a big difference is open up the Mishnah in Kalayim and just start reading a few chapters of it. You'll see it's much more complicated. So the case over here, this is pointing out, is that if he's already known to be a haver and trustworthy on Tohoros, he already is careful and knows how to deal with the easier thing, which is going to be dealing with maestros and the tithes. But what this is implying is that somebody who is careful on maestros does not necessarily mean that they're trustworthy on Tohoros, because Tohoros are more complicated and harder. So A goes to B, logically, but B does not necessarily go to A. They're not reflexive. So the Gemara is now going to talk about a brisa that explains who must make a formal commitment to the Tohoros practices in order to be considered a haver. And the Gemara continues and says, it was taught in a brisa, anyone who comes to be accepted as a haver with regards to Tohoros must commit publicly to the practices mentioned in the Mishnah. And it says even someone who is already acting like a haver, in other words, he's already known to keep the laws of Tohoros, and even a Torah scholar. But a Torah scholar who sits in a yeshiva does not need to formally commit to these practices because he already committed to them at the time when he first sat in the yeshiva. So a scholar who teaches Torah to the public, that's going to be what a Torah scholar is, or a Torah scholar is going to be, certainly trusted with regards to Tohoros, if he makes a formal declaration. But somebody who actually sits in the academy has a different status. And even a scholar who teaches Torah publicly is going to be considered a haver if he only made a public commitment to the Tohoros practices. Now, if a scholar sits in the yeshiva, he has to make a public commitment in order to be a haver. So what's going to be the difference with the Torah scholar? So a scholar is going to be deemed to be a haver without having to make the explicit verbal commitment, and he's going to be teaching as well, and he's going to be considered. He has to be sitting for a serious amount of time in the yeshiva. It's not just a guy sitting at a house, reading, a couple of books in the art scroll. That doesn't make you a Torah scholar. You actually have to be in the academy. So the other thing about this I want to point out is that this is a really serious declaration. You're actually going to a bet din with real rabbis there to go and make this declaration. It's not just, okay, I went out to the street and I saw a couple of people and I made a declaration. It's not like that. It's really, a formal thing that you're actually doing in a bet din. That's going to be the halacha l'maisa on that. So the last ruling of this brisa regarding a scholar who sits in the yeshiva is going to be qualified. This again is going to be a guy sitting in the academy, and the Gemara says that Rabbi La said this is true only if he committed to the Tohoros practices initially. And what is that going to mean? In other words, it's going to say that even a scholar who teaches Torah publicly is considered a haver only if he actually makes a formal commitment to the Tohoros practices. And Rabbi La's ruling gets challenged. Rabbi Yossi, this is going to be the Amorah, not the Tana. Rabbi Yossi asks and says, if the brisa means that the person is considered a haver only if he actually commits to the Tohoros practices initially, why did the brisa state this specifically with regards to a haver? That's going to be like a scholar who sits in a yeshiva. And what's going to be the difference? So the Gemara says that even Am Aretz, who is a haver, is committed to the Tohoros practices. And basically Rabbi La says, according to Rosh Cirilio, Rabbi La maintains that even a scholar who teaches publicly is trusted only if he makes an actual public commitment. And most people are trusted only if other Chaverim verify that he's in fact keeping the Tohoros practices at home. And a scholar who teaches Torah publicly is different in that we trust him as soon as he makes the commitment without any other verification. In other words, you don't need somebody to come and say, oh, I see him doing it in his home, he's trustworthy. A Torah scholar who's actually publicly teaching, when he comes and says, okay, I've committed to make this public commitment, he's going to be trusted at a different level than somebody who's not connected to the academy and is not teaching publicly. So the Gemara is going to give support for Rabbi La's view, and the Gemara says that Rabbi La's teaching accords with the commitment made by Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish in the following incident. And it says that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish went up to the house of Rabbi Yanai, and the woman there saw him, and they fled before him. And he said to them, you had a scholarly father in your house who correctly taught you to conduct yourself this way to avoid even someone who teaches Torah publicly. Rish Lakish is, the Chabruta of Rabbi Yochanan, and certainly Rish Lakish taught Torah publicly. He was a great Torah scholar. And the Gemara says, in fact, I'm an Am Haaretz with regards to Tohoros. In other words, he's not careful to avoid Tuma. And so we see this incident that a great Torah scholar like Rish Lakish, who sits in the yeshiva, does not necessarily avoid Tuma. And this supports Rabbi La's view. So the women basically were fleeing from him because they were afraid that their clothing would become temei, and then it would make them temei, and it would make the food temei. So just another note, Rabbi Yanai, who at this time was dead, Rabbi Yanai was one of the rebbes and teachers of Rabbi Yochanan, Chabruta of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. There's another brisa about somebody who has to make a public commitment to Tohoros in order to be considered a Chaver. And the Gemara says that it was taught in a Baraisa, one who wishes to be accepted as a Chaver must proclaim his commitment to a group of 3 Chaverim, and he follows the normal procedure, but his children and the members of his household need only proclaim their commitment to him. So this is a refinement of the law, so that for his underage kids, they just have to say to their daddy, okay, we'll do it. Or his slaves have to commit, or his maids have to commit. There's another version of the Brisa that teaches that there are other teachers of the Brisa who teach as follows. It says, he and his children and the members of his household must all proclaim their commitment to a group of 3 Chaverim in accordance with usual practice. And the Gemara is going to reconcile the 2 versions of this Brisa, one that says he just needs to commit to the father, and the other that also says that the children need to go to the 3 Chaverim. And it's going to reconcile it like this. It's going to say, and the 2 versions do not disagree. Here in the version that rules that the family members need to proclaim their commitment only to the Chaver, the Brisa refers to children who are subordinate to their father. But here, in the version that rules that family members have to proclaim their commitment to 3 Chaverim, the Brisa is referring to children who are not subordinate to their father. Who are children that are not subordinate? In other words, if it's going to be if they accept his direction or not. And so maybe the children are not financially subordinate to the father. So that's going to be, I think, part of the issue. So maybe these other children are going to be older and financially independent, and they don't have to rely on the father for other things like food. So that's what's going to make it an issue. If they're relying on the father for food, then the other brisa where they just make a commitment to the father, that's going to be the case. Now, the brisa is going to support this distinction, and Rabbi Halafta ben Shaul taught and said, children of a Chaver who are adults must proclaim their commitment to a group of 3 Chaverim, but his minor children do not need to proclaim their commitment to him. And we're going to get ready to finish this up with the last segment. And the Gemara says that it was taught in a Baraisa regarding someone who wishes to become a Chaver. And it says, we first befriend him for wings. In other words, we teach him the laws of Netalat Yadayim, which are going to be D'Rabbanan. This, by the way, Netalat Yadayim was set up by both Hillel and Shammai in unison. And this is going to be in order to protect the truma and the holy food for when the for when the temple is rebuilt, and that the people will not forget how to do these basic things in order to keep the trumos tahor. So this is actually going to be something that was set up together. Most people think that, they're always fighting Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, but this was actually done together. So afterwards, we teach him all the other laws of Tohoros, but it first starts with Netalat Yadayim, and the Gemara is going to explain this process in greater details. Rabbi Yitzhak, the son of Rabbi Lazar, said, first we commit to wings. These are Netalat Yadayim. Then to madafot. Madafot, by the way, are madaf is singular, are going to be items that contract light degree of tuma, and these are not going to be something like an av hatuma, like what we're talking about in terms of the sherets, like the dead rat. So these are things that can render food tamei, or can render beverages, but not people or utensils. And these are going to be things that are going to be tamei d'Rabbanan, not d'Oraita. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say then to hestos. This is, by the way, is going to be, hestos means movements. These are going to be this category that's all put together, by the way, in the Torah, the Zav, Zava, Nida, and the woman who gives childbirth. And these are going to be something where the Tuma is is going to be where it's an elevated level of tuma, and these are going to be to people, and they can make utensils or food or people temeh. And then finally, says this Gemara, to the laws of Tohoros as they pertain to maestros. So this is saying the laws of Tuma as it relates to Truma and Kodashim, and this is going to be foods that are in their final holy state, because we know that there's a Doraita, that means there's a rule from the Torah that you have to keep these holy foods tahor, and so we're going to teach them how to do that. So the Gemara finishes up and says that a Gemara cites a Braisa concerning a disqualification being a haver in addition to those mentioned in the Mishnah. It says originally the sages said a haver who became a tax collector, we permanently expel him from his chaveros. So in other words, the tax collector is always going to be, he just forfeits his status as a haver. He has to resign his position as a haver, or he has to resign his position as a tax collector. Why? Because historically the tax collectors were working for a coercive government like the Romans, and a lot of the rulings on the tax collection were not in accordance with financial law in Judaism. So effectively, how can you say this guy is a haver? He's effectively doing, in a way like theft, in a way that's not consistent with Jewish law. A lot of what they would do when you read in the Shas on the tax collection would be really, really insane stuff that would never be tolerated in any country today. So the Gemara says later they revised this decision and they said as long as he's a tax collector, we expel him from his chaveros, and once he leaves his possession as a tax collector, we will then treat him as a haver. In other words, he's on a personal level committed to acting in a better way. And it's going to get into another case that's similar. Chia, the son of Rabbi Bon, says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, a haver who left Eretz Yisrael to go live outside of the land, we do not expel him from his chaveros, but he does revert to being a haver once he returns to Eretz Yisrael without having to make a new commitment. So while he's out of the land, he does not count as a haver, but when he returns back to the land, he counts as a haver and he does not need to make a new commitment. And the Gemara is going to ask a question that gets unresolved or unanswered. And it says, but does an orphan child of a haver not need to be brought close? In other words, that you have to instruct him in the laws of Tohoros and also teach him these things. And of course you do, right? Because otherwise he's going to forget whatever his father taught him. And basically they're saying similarly, a haver who left Eretz Yisrael likely forgot the Tohoros practices, and therefore they should have to recommit in order to do it because they perhaps forgot a lot of this, and the Gemara does not answer it. Tomorrow in Halacha 4, we are going to get into more requisites on tithes, like what happens when you have commercial bakers. So very interesting stuff coming up, and you get special merit for learning these very important D'Rabbanan rules. Have a great day.